Stage 2 of the Overwatch League starts up again today, and behind the scenes there has been a ton of roster moves, as well as an expected big patch meta shift, or at least some believe that. How does this affect the teams? Thought it was a good opportunity to reevaluate my power rankings, and this time tailor fit it just for the stage. Whereas the first one I did was an overall season evaluation, now we can hone in just on this meta for the patch we're going to have. The highest profile roster move has to be Dafran retiring last week. This move has been received largely with support for the streamer, who's now going to be full-time on Twitch rather than grinding his heart out in the Overwatch League, but I have to say, as a selfish fan, I wish we lived in a world where the best players' incentives were aligned with competing, not streaming. But on the same token though, on a human level, you never want to see anybody unhappy with what they do, but he was such an entertaining player to watch, I can't help but feel a little sad to see him go. However, Rain fills that gap in their roster by picking up Babybay, who is one of the approximately 100 DPS players Shock had on their bench, and I think this is actually quite a good transfer. And I think if history worked out a bit differently, we may have been regarding Babybay as one of the most insane aimers right alongside Dafran. Babybay's tenure in Contenders North America showcased some incredible soldier tracking, and although he might not be an elite level Widowmaker, he is elite level on a few roles, and considering we're in a weird 3-3 meta, he's probably playing Zarya anyway, which should mean he fills into Dafran's shoes quite nicely. Moving along now, there was big changes between the teams Boston Uprising and Dallas Fuel. Cocco, who was a former player turned tank coach, steps down from the Fuel, but they pull in Daemon, who was just the coach for Paris Eternal. And you gotta think that's a huge upgrade. This is the guy that coached Fate for the LA Valiant, and let me just say, he hasn't looked quite the same since his coach moved on. Not only that, there was player transfers where there was a straight 1-for-1 trade between Dallas and Uprising, sending Note and RCK the other direction. This is kind of a weird one, and I'm nearly positive Boston Uprising keeps playing this Moneyball approach and made some bank on this transfer, because although RCK was proving to be quite a flex tank in his own right, especially for this meta with his decent Sombra play, Note has been a straight-up savage on the Uprising, probably the biggest playmaker behind Fusions on that team. Not to mention, Coach Jane has experience working with him for the Overwatch World Cup for Team Canada. Although they'll lose some of the flexibility they got with RCK, I think you gotta consider this an upgrade for the Fuel, who have always had problems in the Diva department. Well, no more. There's other news and pickups, but those were the ones that I thought had the biggest impact into how we evaluate the team. Now let's move on to my Stage 2 power rankings. I'm gonna do these a little bit differently than I've done before, as to get through them in more of a rapid pace, or at least attempt to anyway. The first thing I want to note is what you probably want to look to whenever you evaluate anybody's power rankings is what basis are they grounded on? Mainly, what meta do you think we're going to be seeing into Stage 2? As we've expressed on this channel previously, Winston Goats I still think is an outrageous comp. And on different Overwatch podcasts and on the Twitter sphere, social media in general, there seems to be a lot of optimism for DPS play coming back in a big way, and I just don't see it happening. I think Bunker on point A defenses will definitely be a thing, but I actually think we may see less wacky DPS comps than we did in Stage 1, mainly because Winston Goats is so much better now, and boops to keep characters like Wrecking Ball off you are so much more reliable that although you're losing some of the power Reinhardt used to have, it doesn't really hurt you because the DPS comps wanted to face Reinhardt anyway. So if they're not playing Reinhardt, you get doubly burned to try to go DPS, and then they have Winston Goats, which are strong against DPS comps anyway, now with better boops to be even stronger against engages, control the point even better than they used to without a Reinhardt. Now Brig's even scarier, she gets a buff, she's even more scary as a replacement main tank. For example, on Oversight just yesterday, whole lot of optimism for what the potential that Baptiste can bring. I actually think he's really unpickable most of the time and not very strong, and the idea of substituting him for Brigitte is a bit of a pipe dream and ignores some of the core principles of why 3-3 works. Brig has melee, it goes through barriers, she has her own shield to be a replacement main tank, and Amplification Matrix as an ultimate is way harder to get value out of than Brig Rally. Rally gets just as many free kills by pressing Q and W, whereas Amp Matrix is way more gimmicky, doesn't last as long, doesn't stall the objective, which is one of the most important things in this meta. So all these things considered, I think we can fully expect Winston Goats to be the primary comp that beats most things, and that's what we should be judging these teams based on. Now, with all that being the case, setting the template for this discussion, this is my new power rankings for Stage 2. As you can see, I had to bend my rules a little bit and create an extra tier. So I have S, A, B, and then a C tier, but also like a half step between C and D. Because of course, there really is only one D tier, and that belongs to Mayhem and the Washington Justice. I think both of these teams are extremely underprepared for the level of competition they're going to go up against. A big part of Florida's problem is that I think they actually have some decent talent, but every time we look at this team, it's like they're so seriously mismanaged that they can't get any reliable production out of anybody, and the Washington Justice, I think, would struggle to be competitive in some contenders regions. They look unwilling to commit and make plays, and even when they do, they don't look to command their decision making. These are two teams that I wish would just abandon the GOATS meta altogether. You don't have the coordination or talent of your teamwork to get it to work. Go the full Chengdu route and toss a lot of DPS at your problems, because you actually have some talented DPS players on these teams. I think they'd have the most success trying to play counter meta as hard as possible, boom or bust. Or else there's going to be a lot of losses in this stage for them. Now, moving on to the C- tier. These are teams that have the potential to move up a step, to be among their C tier brethren, but have something that's holding them back that they're going to have to improve into Stage 2 in order to make that upgrade. Both the Valiant and the Houston Outlaws are pretty poor when it comes to map 5s. Remember, Valiant went 0-7, but took NYXL to 5 maps. Houston has a serious problem with the roster roulette they have to play in order to get everybody in on their best roles at the same time. Jake is their best Brigitte by far, but Linkser's required for them to play Widow. Dante's their best player overall, but if you play all three of them at once, you're not going to have the off-tank power. Houston has a serious nightmare when it comes to managing their roster, so much so that they sometimes accidentally put in the wrong player. But that's neither here nor there. I'm optimistic for Valiant moving forward because they have a new head coach who I would assume would take 2 seconds to evaluate the whole Kuki on Lucio situation and say, no, we're not doing that. That's ridiculous. Custa's brain is too big to start? No, we're going to do the work to play better. Get our best players in, stop with this mismanagement nightmare, and I think Valiant has the potential to upgrade. It's just too much of a gamble to say they definitely will without knowing how they're going to play it out. As for the Paris Eternal, though, I've had a roller coaster of emotions about this team. I'll have to admit, I bought into the early hype with this team because they looked so coordinated at outplaying damage comps, but it became known that later, well, damage comps just aren't relevant, so that skill set doesn't matter. You need to be able to go hard in the paint, in the brawl, in the GOATS mirror, and that's something Paris struggles to do. Mainly around how much they rely on Cruz, who's getting reputation to be a bad player, but I don't think that's the case. I think they're just one-dimensional, and without Cruz going super aggro to set up big plays, they don't have a lot left in the tank, and the Atlanta Reign were the ones who really exposed that last stage. They lack firepower in their Zarya position, and I think you could say the same thing about a team like the Boston Uprising, but they have a super-powered main tank and some incredible shot calling. Paris doesn't seem to command the ult economy game or the frontline battle as well as Boston does with similar weaknesses. And overall, I don't see much of this changing coming into Stage 2 on a new patch. Now, moving on to my C tier of teams, I think a lot of people disagree on the power of the Chinese teams in the region. Somehow they just all wound up in the same tier. I just realized that now. But for example, the Chengdu Hunters got massively overrated as if they're some sort of DPS powerhouse team when they were just the only team to play DPS up against tanks, but still lost most of the time. Let's not forget that. Yes, they had an epic series up against the Titans when Bumper was feeding his brains out, but even if DPS come back into the meta, I think Chengdu's gonna look worse, not better, because it's easy to look good as a DPS player when you're shooting down at tanks and Brigitte. It's a whole different story when you start getting into duels, and a key one would be Bacon Jack on Widowmaker, who I don't have much faith is an elite level Widow. Shooting at targets that can't shoot back is a lot easier than taking DPS duels. Jinmu has impressed though. Ah Meng's a fun player to watch, but this team's one-dimensional. Ranked above them, conversely, is the Guangzhou Charge, who I do think have the DPS powerhouse to play this style. They've sort of flirted with it a bit. Hoppa's Tracer and Happy's Widowmaker are on that level where I'm like, okay, we're playing with fire here. And out of the 3 of the Chinese teams, Guangzhou's probably the one I think I'm underrating the most. Their results have just been all over over the place that I don't have confidence in knocking them up a tier, but I could see that happening. Same thing with the Spark. They're a team that rumors abound said were doing great in scrims, but were reported to have severe stage anxiety, even some of their players stepping aside to throw up due to all the anxiety. So that's something you're probably going to have to work out. Also, I have to imagine the language mix isn't working out so well for the Spark. Gushui is clearly the better tank, but there were so many moments where the Spark shot calling just looked horrific that until they start to improve that, they're not going to compete on stage at a higher tier anyway. But they definitely have the talent to move up, I'd say. The Dragons in Boston are interesting. Obviously, Boston's the first team to drop a series to the Shanghai Dragons, making history, but Dragons did move on to be competitive, just not elite. With both of these teams, I feel like they just lack the correct firepower to be strong in this meta or even a slightly different meta. Players like Color Hex on Boston and Diem on the Dragons both badly need DPS to be meta again to feel more comfortable and at home. Ding, Sombra, and Pharah has been a sight to behold, but the overall team power isn't quite high enough to reliably beat teams that are higher on this list. Same thing with Boston. They can have the cleanest team play all you want. They play the ult economy game really well, but they're so reliant on Fusion's shot calling and Reinhardt play that it's hard for me to bump them up, considering as well, Reinhardt is looking to be one of the biggest losers in this Stage 2 patch. So I don't know how the heck Fusions is going to carry from the Rein position, and his Winston, let's face it, is just not as impactful. It's fine, but after Boston needing him to overperform so often, I think he's going to struggle to do that, and the buck will get passed down the line to teammates that are less capable. Moving on to the B tier, where the Fuel were just a few maps away from getting into playoffs. Toronto and the Reign did make it, but had a bit of an easier schedule, and London somehow is here, just on the mere fact that their power level can never be measured by how much they win or lose. They're one of the most variable teams next to the Philadelphia Fusion, who are comfortable at playing so loose that they'll give away a lot of series in the regular season, but you better watch out if they make it to the playoffs. And now that Reinhardt's taking a step back, and the two comps I think were going to be played the most, Orisa Bunker and Winston Goats, well, that just means Gesture makes a massive swing back to being a top-level player again. That being said, I'm a bit suspicious of some of these teams, and I could see them falling down and trading with anybody below them that makes a big improvement in Stage 2, particularly because Toronto Defiant just lost Steller, which is probably a big deal, and doesn't really rise to the occasion to play the top-level teams, but they just consistently beat lower-ranked teams, so until they stop doing that, it's hard to rank them much lower, but they're probably more akin to the power level of a C-level team. Atlanta Reign has looked all over the place. The acquisition of Baby may be equal, if not better than Dafran, at least on Zarya, but I think they've got bigger problems elsewhere. Luckily, they have a great Lucio player, which starts to matter more and more to me as we get up on this list, and it's one of the main reasons why I have the Dallas Fuel on top of the B tier. Closer has been a massive playmaker for this team, and the team overall has made space for Unko to be a very consistent performer. AKM is an elite level Zarya, and now they have Note as well. One of their weakest players has been OGE, but I think he'll find himself to be more comfortable in a more Winston-dominated meta. Now, moving up to my second highest tier, the A tier. The LA Gladiators may not have made playoffs last stage, but I think it finally came together in the last couple weeks, and we started to see this elite level team come into its own. Their backline doesn't look as powerful as it did last year in comparison to the rest of the teams because everybody's upgraded, but they're solid. Decay has looked mechanically insane, and now that he's syncing up a bit better with his old teammate Roar, this is where this team really starts to get in stride. Roar had a rough start of the season, but even on the Reinhardt, he started to upgrade. He prefers Winston, as frankly, a ton of main tanks seem to anyway. Whichever way the meta presses, I think they'll be fine. And oddly enough, it's a similar story between the Fusion and the Seoul Dynasty. Both of them have main tanks that prefer playing Winston. And although Fleta and Carpe might not be the most elite level Zarya players, if DPS is viable in the slightest degree and they can reliably pull it out, it's tough to bet against these teams up against most of the teams I ranked below them. Philly, of course, is always prone to drop series to teams that they shouldn't, but they always rise to the occasion, and Seoul have shown us that they actually can get their big brain analysts to work to really dissect the playstyle of a team like NYXL. I think largely we need to be giving kudos to the game plan and coaching that helped Seoul steal a playoff run from the NYXL. Michelle had Jonak's number, and of course, despite both of these teams losing in the stage playoffs up against the S-tier teams, this whole bracket, I think, performs quite favorably against the rest of the league, solidifying their position in A tier. Now moving on to the exciting S tier, where I just had to drop NYXL into third place. They may clean up regular season games better than the two teams above them because, frankly, let's be honest, Vancouver may have dropped a series or two with how flippant they seem to play in the regular season, or just at all, I guess. And Shock played some incredibly close series up against the three teams they lost in Stage 1. But regardless how you shuffle these three, I think they're pretty dominantly at the top. Interestingly enough, of these upper bracket teams, these are the ones that had the most success with their Reinhardt play, which luckily for them, doesn't go away entirely. It's just that Winston can contest Rein a lot better, whereas in the Stage 1 patch, once Rein got into the correct space, he would just clobber Winston in like a 70-30 matchup or something. Whereas now, again, if you get to the space Rein wants, he's still better than Winston, but there's tons of spots where Winston will just farm Rein goats due to the way that he farms up Primal better thanks to the big increase of damage Winston gets up against armor. But either way, these teams should be able to play Winston as well. I expected Bumper's Winston to be better than his Reinhardt after watching him in Contenders Korea. The Vancouver Titans have the most to worry about if DPS come back in a big way because their bench isn't that deep, but that's fine. They would just start Stitch and Haxel if that was the case, because Hureg and Suminsu I don't think are elite tier in the DPS department, and Shock and NYXL of course have a wealth of DPS players. Nixel probably fares the best, as I think they have the highest peak performance potential out of their DPS. And another thing you'll notice out of these top three teams, really strong Lucio play. Animo's the most defensive and isn't quite up there with Slime and Moth, but I think those two probably have to be called the best Lucios in the league right now and bear a significant weight of carry in the GOATS meta. At the break of the fight and the ult fight, Lucio does an amazing amount to set up the team, and now with the rework to Lucio's skill set, Moth and Slime look to be the two players that I think would benefit the most. They're doing these Reddit boop shenanigan playstyles anyway, so the gap between them and the other Lucios might get even wider. Overall though, I'm confident in keeping the Titans at the #1 spot. I think they have the best Brig player who isn't going anywhere. In fact, Brig got buffed, remember that. And to me, Haxel is the best. All three of these Zaryas are elite tier. However, it should be noted that the splash damage nerf on Zarya's right click will hurt a playstyle like Sinatra, who likes to go for wide angles for big splash into the backline to hit multiple targets and farm Grav. That playstyle's a little bit harder to execute, but maybe that just means in comparison, a guy as skilled as Sinatra just looks even better away from the pack than he did before, which is often how some of these balance reworks make things. Sometimes not changing the meta necessarily, but changing how difficult it is or how much skill it takes to execute the plays you used to be able to get a little bit easier. So I think if you're any of these teams, you probably are looking fine into the next patch. Stage 2 goes live today. I'm excited to check out the action, and I hope you are too. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out and lets us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and be sure to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been FREEDO for your Overwatch. See you guys next time.